Well, as we hear this week, Job is at the bottom of the barrel, or in a song I once heard, the bottom of the whiskey bottle, but probably no whiskey involved. He's at the bottom of the barrel. We have a young man, faithful in his religious observance, left utterly bewildered. Each of these main characters in today's readings are upended. They both have lived faithful and observant lives, careful to align with the ways of God as known to them, and they are turned on their heads. Both, of course, indwell a world of God presence they thought they knew. Just as we gathered here have some sense of God presence in the world. Of course, some of us may struggle with the God word, but I think we have a sense of some presence that has been labelled God. A few years ago, when I was working at the cathedral, it just so happened that Prince William was visiting the country, I think with the Lions rugby tour. He happened to say he wanted to come to the Sunday service at the cathedral, but it wasn't an official visit, so there was no advertising. Of course, when you live in a house with a 16-year-old daughter, it might have slipped. So she decided to come to church that week when Prince William was present, and she invited a friend to come. The week following, she shared with me how she had had to provide her friend with a running commentary of what was happening in the service. Her friend had never encountered anything to do with God or with church, so she had no idea what was going on or what anything meant. My daughter reflected. I didn't realise how much I knew. I mean, it's like it's just a part of me without me thinking about it. Now, I happen to know that that friend of hers had had to face a whole lot of incredibly challenging things for such a young person. And it made me wonder how she had managed to negotiate them without any kind of larger-than-life God context. It also made me aware of my assumption of God presence in life. I can't imagine otherwise, so for me to be mindful not to presume this is the same for everyone. Well, Job last week at the outset would not curse God, despite the fact that Satan had visited evil things upon him. This week, Job is in deepest despair at the aching absence of God. In the words he uses, he's almost unsaying the reassurance of Psalm 139. In all ways that God is meant to be present, God is absent. If only there was something Job could do. If only there was a way he could argue his case. He's terrified at the God absence he cannot escape. He cries, God has made my heart faint. The Almighty has terrified me. If only I could vanish in darkness, and thick darkness would cover my face. If only it were possible to escape the potency of God's absent presence. I am sure that each of us here have had times in our life when the absence of God is utterly real. When certainty of God flees and faith seems ludicrous. Bewildered, for there is nothing we can do. We too wish that we could flee the overwhelming absent presence of God. Such things make sense. They relate to the experience of those of us who inhabit a God-presence world. However, like my daughter's friend, we now live in a world where there are more and more people who do not know what we are talking about when it comes to God stuff. A world where God is neither familiar nor even known to many. I remember a conversation I had once again a while ago with a woman who had come to talk to me about getting her child baptised. As her story unfolded, I learned that she had been raised in a family where there was no conversation or engagement about God or Bible stories or church. This was intentional. Her parents had suffered at the hands of the church. They did not want their children to suffer the same. In early adulthood, she happened to get a job working on a boat in the Sea of Galilee. And as she worked there, she started hearing stories about Jesus, stories located in the landscape that surrounded the lake. As she heard the stories, she came to realize how many of them, the anecdotes and the imagery of them, populated the everyday language in which she had grown up. Reflecting back, she remembered as a youngster not really understanding turns of phrase that people used, or images or anecdotal references that people freely used. She didn't know what they meant or what was being talked about. She felt as if she had missed a whole level of nuance and meaning. She didn't want her little one to miss this richness as they were growing up. A few years later from that conversation, now, I wonder, what if our world is the opposite way round now? What if people don't know what we're talking about when we reference Bible sayings, images, gospel anecdotes? What does it look like to articulate faith, God presence, in a world where we cannot presume this is known? Where God absence is the norm rather than moments of God absent presence. Now, I'm not denying our own experience of God presence, but maybe to teach us not to presume. That we are no longer bearers of what we've understood as a dominant and often dominating story. To tell it, we may need to unstitch our certainty and learn anew to articulate and enact what we know. A bit like the young man in today's gospel. We don't actually know he's wealthy until the end of the story. He is an exemplar of faith. All his life he has lived faithfully according to the commandments. They have provided him certainty. They have provided him a foundation upon which to build a life aligned with God. This young man, we learn, is seeking to inherit eternal life, only to learn his wealth, that he may well have understood as a sign of God's favour, that wealth has become his stumbling block. It is utterly bewildering. To set a plan, to be obedient to the rules, is all well and good, and it may well lend us some certainty of which many of us prefer. But when it comes to this faith stuff, the focus can end up being all about us and what we can do, rather than how we can enact the life of God in the world. Jesus' teaching to the disciples is perplexing and upending. Peter, good old Peter, like the young man, he wants some certainty. Come on, Jesus, give us the gospel. He wants some reassurance that they have made the right choice. Of course, says Jesus. Well, kind of. Kind of says yes. Certainty continues to be elusive. It seems to me that Jesus is suggesting that learning to give up the things we are most attached to, including that God who makes us feel secure and provides certainty, giving that up, we may actually come to encounter the living God rather than our idea of God. All a bit strange, really. But it is an interesting proposition to consider as we live in our time of history, as we live in this time of our church, where the idea of God and the society in which we are embedded is uncertainly known. forfeiting certainty and assumed dominance is perplexing, unnerving, and quite frankly, terrifying. We do have a place, and we do have a story to tell, an alternative way to live, and that is valuable. The credibility of this story, perhaps in part, in fairness, because of its association with church, can no longer be assumed. So when we speak about this that we know, I believe we need to do so honestly and without guile, to know who we are in the telling, what we are seeking to say, and why. That the words we use are not just intellectual propositions, but they are deep words from our living this way and our genuine engagement with this way. Not a rhetoric of persuasion, but simply of what we know. The difference it makes to have this God presence, or however we describe that presence with us. The influence this has upon and changes how we live. And that difference is made known through the way we are. It's made known in the way we act in the world, how we are, not because we have dominance or power. The Gospels, the Jesus stories, God presence becomes articulated and understood through who we are and how we are. As with humility, we genuinely, quietly but powerfully live out the alternative way. Engaging, participating, using all our skills and our capacities and abilities to influence, for sure, influenced and act to make real the gospel-aligned, God-infused world we inhabit.